As part of my work, I'm often invited to sit with leadership teams as they navigate challenges in their community, conflict, discernment, difficult decisions, just plain old change. And while the circumstances in every church are unique, there are some common themes in how leaders tend to respond to challenges. And I've found it helpful to represent these with a simple little chart. If you'll permit me 5 minutes, I'd like to explain it to you. So you see 4 boxes, and then there's 2 axes. The y-axis going up and down. That tells us how much a leader thinks of their job as like challenging their people. Like, how firm are you as a leader? How much do you lead with conviction? How focused are you on things like expectations and accountability and outcomes? Now, the x-axis, left to right, tells us how much a leader thinks of their job as supporting their people. So we talk about this in terms of fairness. These are people who lead with compassion. They're all about encouraging relationships. They think maybe more in terms of process than outcomes. They want to keep everyone feeling good together. Now, if you are high in challenge and low in support, we call that the authoritarian box. Although no one who leads that way would probably call themselves authoritarian. In a church, you'd probably hear these folks describe themselves as prophetic leaders. So they'll tend to talk about the importance of upholding truth. They tend to be fairly directive and results-oriented. They think of their job as, telling people what they need to hear. Now, if you are low in challenge and high in support, and you're down here, we call that the permissive box. Though, again, no one who leads that way would probably call themselves permissive. You'll probably hear these folks describe themselves as pastoral. And instead of talking a lot about truth, you'll probably hear them talking more about grace. They tend to think in terms of, how can we make room for everyone to be valued and belong? They think of their job as really meeting people where they're at. All right. Now, if you are low in challenge and low in support, you're probably a Christian Reformed Church Council. Just kidding. Sort of. Folks in this neglectful box like to say, in the time-honored tradition of Christian Reformed churches, let's let the next council deal with this one. These folks tend to be kind of passive and avoidant. They like to kick the can down the road. They like to sweep things under the rug. All right, you can tell, because the box is golden, where I want you to be. We want leaders who are high in challenge and high in support. We call this the restorative box. Folks who lead from here are authoritative without being authoritarian. They're trusted because they take the truth seriously and because people feel respected by them. These are folks who can move forward toward an outcome without leaving people behind. Now, we sometimes represent these 3 boxes with prepositions and adverbs. So the authoritarian does things to people. The permissive does things for people. The neglectful does not do things. And the restorative does things with people. Now, all of us have default ways of leading. And I think probably every church has a default way of being. So just an example, I'm a parent of 3 young kids. I tend to be kind of authoritarian with my boys, always telling them what to do, and a little permissive with my daughter. As a pastor of a small church, I probably tended to be more permissive, and I missed important opportunities to be a little more firm or prophetic. So all of us have defaults, but by God's grace, we still often can get to that top right box. Like Christ, we hold together grace and truth, compassion and conviction, the pastoral and the prophetic. But now here's the trick. What happens when things get anxious? What happens when there's a conflict, when there's a tough decision to be made, when numbers are down, when things are not going well? Well, when things start getting anxious in your church, leaders tend to slide back into their default. So instead of moving up and to the right and sort of rising to the occasion, so to speak, we move down into the left. It's just a natural consequence of anxiety. So when I'm sitting with a council that's been facing a conflict or dealing with a contentious issue, I'll often just ask, like, over the last few weeks or months, which box have you spent the most time in? Which box has the council spent the most time in? It's interesting to sometimes just have everybody plot it on a piece of paper in front of them and then put it up on the board, see where everybody landed. But it's a worthwhile question for you too. Which box have you been leading out of? Which box has your council been leading out of? And then, is there anything you could do this week or this month to move up and to the right? So if you've been pretty squarely in the authoritarian box, is there a way you could increase your support of your people? Or if you've been in the permissive box, is there a way you could move toward actually making some concrete decisions? Now, you may not be able to get all the way to the top right corner. That's okay. Actually, I think some situations really call for a council to lean into the prophetic or the pastoral. Sometimes even saying no, the neglectful box, is probably the most faithful response. But in my experience, almost every leadership team in most situations benefits from moving at least a little bit up and to the right from wherever they are now. So the question is, how do you do it? How do you move up and to the right? Well, one of the best ways I know to move to the right, to increase support, is to listen. More specifically, you move to the right by listening to understand other people, not listening to argue with them. You know the difference? Listening to argue is listening just long enough to formulate your clever response to totally dismantle your opponent. Turns out that's not super helpful for building community. But listening to understand is quieting your internal defenses, accepting that I might not know everything there is to know about this situation, and honestly trying to hear the other person. To do listening in an anxious situation, that's tricky. It's just hard to listen well when you're anxious. So we find that if you add a little structure, it helps. And it can feel a little patronizing sometimes, but what we'll often recommend in anxious situations is to set up a listening circle. In a listening circle, you define some norms, you prepare some questions ahead of time, and when you're listening, you pass a talking piece, and only the person with the talking piece may speak. And what we find, I know it's a little gimmicky, but what we find is that listening circles are a pretty reliable way to move to the right without necessarily sacrificing your prophetic role. You know, listening doesn't mean you have to agree. Listening doesn't mean you'll only ever listen and never make decisions. Listening is just a really concrete way to love another person. So that's if you need to move to the right. If you need to move up, we recommend paying attention to fair process principles. Now, fair process tries to understand how to help a person stay engaged, stay connected, even if they disagree with a decision leadership has made. I sometimes say that if listening is a way to love someone personally, fair process is a way to love someone procedurally. So I like to define fair process actually by what it's not. So in fair process, you do not rush. You don't speed to fix things. Instead, you slow down and you ask, who's affected and how? Can we engage them somehow? Fair process also does not hush. So once you've identified who's affected, who might have a stake, You take the time to actually listen to them. You take their concerns seriously, even if you disagree. So no rush, no hush. And finally, fair process avoids mush. So when leadership teams get anxious, things often get murky. It's often unclear who is making a decision or what precisely a decision means. We set aside our formal decision-making procedures, with motions and minutes and committees, for informal ones, parking lot agreements, backroom deals. And all the while, the people we're leading, they feel confused and frustrated. When your leadership team rushes, hushes, or mushes, it tends to break down trust right at the moment, right? Moment of conflict, big decisions, right at the moment when you could use all the goodwill you can get. So if you find that you're in that bottom right quadrant, one way to move up is to evaluate your decision making according to fair process. If you'd like help knowing how you can move up and to the right, contact us at crcna.org/PCR. We offer a consultation for all kinds of situations, and we also have specific resources to help your church navigate conflict and to discern and decide well in conflicted situations.